Your lakefront property now belongs to the HOA. You have 30 days to vacate or we'll force you out. That's what the HOA Karen told me after I banned her son and his friends from partying at my lake cabin. She stood there with her fake smile, waving legal documents while her precious boy had just destroyed my 20-year memorial garden. When I told them to get off my property, she immediately called the cops, claiming I was illegally blocking community access. This woman thought she had all the power, all the control, but what she didn't know was that karma was about to hit her harder than she ever imagined. Where are you watching this BD Stories episode from? Drop your location in the comments. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my late brother David's lake cabin that Saturday morning, expecting peace after a brutal week at work. Instead, I found devastation. The lavender garden David had nurtured for 20 years was flattened, every flower crushed into mud. The solar lights were snapped, pieces scattered like broken bones. But worst of all was the small stone bird he'd carved before cancer took him, now shattered in 3 pieces by the lake's edge. Stunned, I remembered the security camera David had installed under the eaves. He'd always worried about break-ins after he got sick. I rushed inside, powered up his old desktop, and pulled the footage from the night before. What I saw made my hands shake with rage. Around 8 p.m., a group of 5 young adults had set up what looked like a full-scale party on the grass by the lake. They had brought speakers, coolers full of beer, and apparently zero respect for other people's property. The leader of the group was a cocky-looking kid with bleached hair who was clearly calling the shots. The footage showed me approaching them around 9:30, and I could hear my own voice through the camera's audio, asking politely if they could keep the noise down. I watched myself gesture toward the cabin, explaining that this was private property and requesting that they clean up after themselves. The bleach-hair kid's response was burned into my memory. "Listen, old man, this is HOA common land. I have every right to be here. You want quiet? Go back to your house." I had walked away that night thinking maybe these were just kids being kids, but the security footage revealed something that made my stomach drop. After I had gone back inside, the ringleader had stood up, looked directly at the camera, and said to his friends with a cruel laugh, "Watch this, guys. Time to teach the old man a lesson." Then he had deliberately walked over to the lavender garden and systematically destroyed it, stomping on every flower while his friends cheered him on. This wasn't kids being kids. This was calculated, intentional vandalism designed to send me a message. But there was something else in the footage that made me rewind and watch again. Something that changed everything about this situation. I ran outside and approached my neighbor Henry, an elderly man with silver hair who was watering his vegetable garden. Henry had lived here for decades and knew everyone in the community. When I showed him the photos of the destroyed garden on my phone, he shook his head sadly and said, "I've been warning people about Patricia Walsh for years, but nobody listens. She's been consolidating power in this HOA since she became president, and now she thinks she owns the whole lake." I asked him who Patricia Walsh was, and Henry's expression grew grim. "She's the HOA president, and that bleached hair kid is causing all the trouble? That's her son, Jack-Ack. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, if you know what I mean." As Henry spoke, I showed him the screenshot from the security footage that had caught my attention. In the background, partially hidden behind some trees about 50 yards away, there was a black Mercedes sedan with a license plate that matched the format of luxury vehicles in our county. Henry glanced at the image and nodded knowingly. "That's Patricia's car, all right. She drives that Mercedes everywhere, thinks it makes her look important. But what was she doing here last night? Hiding in the trees while her son destroyed your garden?" The question hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. This hadn't been a random act of teenage rebellion. This had been orchestrated, planned, and deliberate. I thanked Henry for his time and walked back to the cabin, my mind racing with questions. As I sat on the porch steps, holding the letter I'd written to David but never sent, I realized that this peaceful retreat my brother had left me was about to become the center of a war I didn't understand. The letter in my hands contained all the things I'd wanted to tell my brother about how much this place meant to me. How it was the only place I felt close to him after his death. Now, looking at the destruction around me, I felt like someone was trying to erase not just the garden, but David's memory itself. The security footage had revealed that Jack-Ack's vandalism wasn't random teenage mischief. It was a coordinated attack, supervised by his mother, the HOA president. But why would Patricia Walsh, someone I'd never met, orchestrate such a cruel attack on my brother's memorial garden? What did she hope to gain from this deliberate act of destruction? And more importantly, what was she planning to do next? Comment below if you think Patricia had this planned from the beginning, or if it was just a coincidence. I spent the next morning printing out screenshots from the security footage and organizing them into a clear timeline of events. As a data analyst, I knew the importance of having solid evidence before making any accusations. I drove to Patricia Walsh's address, which Henry had provided, and found myself standing in front of an imposing 2-story house with perfectly manicured landscaping. The same black Mercedes from the security footage was parked in the circular driveway, confirming that this was indeed the woman who had supervised her son's destruction of my brother's garden. Patricia Walsh answered the door wearing an expensive silk blouse and an expression of mild annoyance, as if my presence was an inconvenience she hadn't scheduled. She was probably in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from being used to getting your way. I introduced myself as David's brother and explained that I owned the lake cabin. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded, but she maintained her composure. "Oh yes, the cabin. I'm so sorry for your loss. David was a wonderful man," she said, though her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation. I showed her the photos of the destroyed garden and the security footage of JACA's deliberate vandalism, expecting some kind of apology or offer to make things right. Instead, she examined the evidence with the kind of detached interest you might show when looking at someone else's vacation photos. "I understand you're upset, but JACA is just a young man, and young men sometimes make poor choices. Perhaps you should consider that you might be overreacting to what amounts to a harmless prank." Her tone was condescending, like she was explaining something to a child who didn't understand how the world worked. When I pointed out that this was clearly documented vandalism, not a prank, and that I had video evidence of her son's admission that this was intentional retaliation, Patricia's demeanor changed completely. She gestured toward a wall covered with framed certificates and awards, all related to her HOA leadership. "You need to understand something about this community," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I've been the elected HOA president for 3 consecutive years. I know the rules and regulations here better than anyone, and I think you should familiarize yourself with them before making accusations against respected members of this community." Then came the threat that would haunt me for weeks to come. Patricia looked me directly in the eyes and said, "If you're not comfortable with our community guidelines, perhaps you should consider whether this is the right place for you. Sometimes people find that they're happier when they move somewhere more suitable to their expectations." The words were delivered with a smile, but the message was crystal clear. Conform to her vision of the community or face the consequences. When I asked her about her car being at the scene during the vandalism, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "I drive through the community regularly as part of my HOA duties." "I'm sure you're mistaken about what you think you saw." The conversation was going nowhere, so I decided to take a different approach. I spent the rest of the afternoon crafting a handmade wooden sign that read, "Pilgrim Property, Please Respect," in carefully carved letters. I treated it with weather-resistant stain and installed it at the edge of the lakefront area where Jake Ack and his friends had held their destructive party. The sign was tasteful, professional, and clearly marked the boundary of what I believed to be my property. I felt like I was finally taking some control of the situation, establishing clear boundaries that even Patricia couldn't dispute. But my sense of accomplishment was short-lived. The next morning, I woke to find the sign had been completely destroyed. It wasn't just removed or knocked over. It had been deliberately torn from its posts and thrown into the lake, where it was now floating like driftwood. The ground around where it had been installed was churned up with tire tracks and boot prints, clear evidence that this had been another intentional act of vandalism. I waded into the shallow water to retrieve what was left of my sign, feeling my anger building with each soggy piece of wood I pulled from the lake. When I returned to the cabin, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox that would change everything. The return address was the HOA Management Company, and inside was a formal violation notice that made my blood pressure spike. The notice stated that I was being fined $500 for installing unauthorized signage without proper HOA approval in violation of Section 12.c regarding lakefront scenic harmony. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. They were fining me for putting up a simple property marker on my own land, and the fine was completely disproportionate to the supposed violation. Henry came over when he saw me standing by my mailbox, staring at the violation notice with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "She got you with Section 12.c, didn't she?" he said with a knowing shake of his head. "I tried to warn everyone when she pushed that amendment through 2 years ago. The language is deliberately vague, giving her way too much power over lakefront property. He explained that Section 12.c was Patricia's pet project, a sweeping rule that supposedly protected the scenic harmony of the lake area, but was written so broadly that it could be interpreted to mean almost anything. I was one of only 3 people who voted against it, but Patricia had already built up enough support to get it passed. I spent the evening studying the HOA rulebook, all 47 pages of it, trying to understand what I was dealing with. Section 12.c was indeed written in the kind of legal language that seemed designed to be confusing. It talked about maintaining aesthetic harmony and protecting community access to natural scenic resources, but never clearly defined what those terms meant. The more I read, the more I felt like I was being drawn into a trap that I didn't fully understand. Patricia Walsh clearly knew something about this community and these rules that I didn't, and she was using that knowledge as a weapon against me. Type, trap if you think Patricia had this setup planned all along. I had 25 days to pay the $500 fine or face what the notice ominously called additional legal consequences. The pressure was mounting, and I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before Patricia could spring whatever trap she was setting. I decided to dig into the history of the property, starting with the boxes of documents David had left in the cabin's storage room. As I began sorting through decades of paperwork, I could hear the sound of another party starting up by the lake, louder and more defiant than before. Through the cabin window, I watched Jack and his friends set up an even larger sound system than they'd used previously. They had brought camping chairs, a portable fire pit, and what looked like enough alcohol to stock a small bar. But what really caught my attention was the homemade banner they had strung between 2 trees that read, "Still here, deal with it." This wasn't just another party. It was a direct challenge, a way of thumbing their nose at my attempts to protect the property. The message was clear. They knew I was powerless to stop them, and they were enjoying rubbing it in my face. Around midnight, just as I was getting deep into the property documents, a beer bottle came flying through the cabin's front window, shattering glass across the living room floor. The crash was followed by the sound of laughter and cheering from the party outside. Attached to the bottle was a note written in black marker. 24 days left, old man. We'll keep partying right here until you're gone. Jack. I stood there, surrounded by broken glass, holding this threatening note, and realized that this had escalated far beyond simple property disputes. This was systematic intimidation designed to drive me away from my own property. But instead of calling the police or confronting Jack directly, I decided to channel my anger into something more productive. I spent the next several hours methodically going through every document in David's files, looking for anything that might help me understand the legal situation I was facing. Most of it was routine paperwork, insurance documents, tax records, maintenance receipts. But then, buried in a folder labeled Original Property Purchase, I found something that made me stop breathing completely. It was a surveyor's map dated 1987, showing the original property boundaries when David's grandfather had first purchased the land from the state. According to this map, the area that everyone assumed was HOA common land, including the entire lakefront where Jack had been holding his destructive parties, was actually private property that belonged to my family. But this wasn't just about the small strip of shoreline where the parties had been taking place. The original survey showed that my family owned not just the lakefront area, but the entire lake itself and a substantial portion of the surrounding land. We're talking about a prime piece of real estate that could easily be worth millions of dollars in today's market. And somehow, everyone in the community had forgotten or been misled about who actually owned it. I spread the old survey map on the kitchen table next to a current map of the HOA community, and the differences were staggering. The current HOA map showed the lakefront and the lake itself as common recreational area. But according to the original 1987 survey, my family owned everything from the water's edge to 200 feet inland, all the way around the lake's perimeter. Jack hadn't just been trespassing on a small piece of property, he'd been holding his parties on land that legally belonged to me, while his mother, as HOA president, had been facilitating this trespass for years. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Patricia Walsh, as HOA president, would have had access to all the community's legal documents and property records. She would have known about the original property boundaries, which meant she deliberately allowed her son to trespass on private land while knowing it was illegal. But more than that, her aggressive response to my complaints now made perfect sense. She wasn't just protecting her son from consequences, she was protecting herself from a legal situation that could expose years of negligence or possibly even deliberate fraud. I thought about Patricia's confident demeanor when I'd confronted her about Jack's behavior, the way she'd dismissed my concerns and threatened me with HOA regulations. She'd been so sure of herself, so certain that she held all the power in this situation. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated my determination to protect David's legacy and my ability to research complex problems. The original survey map was dated, signed by a licensed surveyor, and filed with the county recorder's office. There was no ambiguity here. The documentation was ironclad. As I sat there at David's old desk, looking out at the lake that apparently belonged to me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was angry about the years of confusion and the current harassment I was facing. But another part of me felt connected to David in a way I hadn't experienced since his death. This place hadn't just been a retreat for him, it had been his inheritance, his connection to our family's history that stretched back generations. The lavender garden that Jack had destroyed wasn't just landscaping, it was part of a legacy that our grandfather had established when he first purchased this land from the state. I photographed every page of the survey document, making sure to capture the surveyor's signature, official seal, and county filing stamps. Then, I drafted a carefully worded email to Patricia Walsh with copies to every member of the HOA Board of Directors. The subject line read, "Urgent. Correction of property boundaries, immediate cessation of trespassing required." In the email, I explained that I had discovered the true legal boundaries of my property and that all HOA activities on the lakefront area needed to stop immediately. I attached high-resolution images of the survey map and demanded an immediate meeting with the board to discuss the implications of this discovery. But as I prepared to send the email, I realized I needed to be strategic about this. Patricia had shown herself to be a skilled manipulator who was comfortable using her position to intimidate people. Simply presenting her with the legal facts might not be enough. I needed to be prepared for whatever counterattack she was planning. I decided to send a much simpler message, one that would let her know I'd discovered her secret without revealing the full extent of my knowledge. I deleted the formal email and wrote something much more direct. "Patricia, I found something interesting in my brother's old papers. I think we need to talk. Comment on your prediction of how Patricia will react when she finds out Marcus discovered the truth." Patricia Walsh never replied to my email. Instead, 2 hours after I sent it, she picked up her phone and called 911. I know this because I heard the sirens coming down the lake road while I was sitting on the cabin porch, drinking my morning coffee, and feeling cautiously optimistic about finally having some leverage in this situation. What I didn't know was that Patricia had just told the emergency dispatcher that she needed to report a hostile neighbor who has been making threats and illegally attempting to prevent community members from using public recreational areas. Officer Rodriguez arrived in his patrol car just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with a professional demeanor and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd dealt with HOA disputes before. I invited him to sit on the porch and immediately began showing him the survey map from 1987, explaining how I'd discovered that the lakefront area was actually private property that belonged to my family. Officer Rodriguez examined the documents carefully, nodding as I walked him through the legal implications. "This does appear to be a legitimate survey," he said, "and if it's accurate, then you're correct about the property boundaries." Just as Officer Rodriguez was beginning to understand my position, Patricia Walsh made her entrance. She didn't just walk up to the cabin, she orchestrated a full presentation. She was carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she was followed by her son Jack, who was wearing a smirk that made me want to punch him. But what struck me most was how prepared she seemed, like she'd been expecting this confrontation and had spent considerable time getting ready for it. Patricia greeted Officer Rodriguez with the kind of familiarity that suggested they'd met before, probably at community events, where she'd made sure to cultivate relationships with local law enforcement. "Officer Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming out here," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with this situation, but I'm afraid we have a very complex legal matter involving a new resident who doesn't understand our community guidelines." The way she said "new resident" made it sound like an accusation, like being new to the community was somehow evidence of wrongdoing. She opened her briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be an official HOA binder, thick with documents and marked with color-coded tabs that suggested extensive organization and preparation. Patricia flipped directly to a page she'd obviously bookmarked in advance, and I realized that she'd been preparing for this exact scenario. Officer Rodriguez, I'd like to direct your attention to Section 12.c of our HOA covenants, which deals with lakefront scenic harmony, she began, reading in a voice that sounded like she was delivering a legal argument she'd rehearsed. In cases where there are disputes regarding lakefront properties, the HOA retains the right to purchase said properties at fair market value to ensure the common good of the community. Fair market value shall be determined by an independent appraisal commissioned by the HOA board. The words hit me like a physical blow. Patricia wasn't just trying to regulate my use of the property. She was claiming the right to force me to sell it, whether I wanted to or not. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Officer Rodriguez with a triumphant smile. We've already commissioned an independent appraisal of the disputed property, as is our right under the community covenants. The fair market value has been determined to be $75,000. We're prepared to purchase the entire lakefront area within 30 days to resolve this dispute and ensure continued community access to our recreational facilities. Officer Rodriguez looked at the appraisal documents, then back at my survey map, clearly trying to figure out how to navigate this legal minefield. I could see him calculating in his head, trying to weigh property rights against HOA regulations, trying to determine what was actually legal and what was just bureaucratic intimidation. The appraisal Patricia had produced looked official, with letterhead and signatures, but I knew enough about real estate to understand that $75,000 for prime lakefront property was ridiculously below market value. This wasn't a fair offer, it was legalized theft. Patricia pressed her advantage, speaking in the kind of reasonable tone that made her sound like the responsible adult in the room. We're not trying to be unfair to anyone, she continued. We're simply trying to maintain the community standards that everyone agreed to when they purchased property in this neighborhood. The lakefront area has been used as a community recreational space for over 15 years. We can't allow one person to suddenly restrict access to facilities that the entire community depends on. Her argument was persuasive in its apparent reasonableness, but I could see the trap she was setting. As I listened to Patricia's presentation, I began to understand the full scope of what I was facing. She wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president throwing her weight around. She was a calculating strategist who had been planning this confrontation from the moment she learned about my property claim. The appraisal for $75,000 was obviously prepared in advance, which meant she'd known about the original property boundaries long before I'd discovered them. She'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for the day when someone would challenge her control over the lakefront area. The realization that Patricia had been planning this for years made me understand why she'd been so confident during our first confrontation. She'd dismissed my concerns about Jack's vandalism because she'd already decided that I wouldn't be staying in the community long enough for it to matter. The Section 12.c clause she was citing had been written specifically to give her the power to force out any property owner who challenged her authority. This wasn't about community standards or recreational access. This was about maintaining her control over the most valuable piece of real estate in the area. Officer Rodriguez found himself in the impossible position of trying to arbitrate a complex property dispute that involved both legitimate legal claims and potentially questionable HOA regulations. The survey map clearly showed that I owned the property, but Patricia's HOA documents seemed to give her the authority to purchase it, whether I wanted to sell or not. This is clearly a complex civil matter, he finally said, and I think both parties need to consult with attorneys to sort out the legal details. It was the kind of diplomatic non-answer that left everyone unsatisfied, but avoided taking sides in a dispute that was clearly beyond the scope of a simple police call. As Officer Rodriguez prepared to leave, Patricia delivered what she clearly intended as the final blow. She looked directly at me with cold, calculating eyes and said, "I want to be very clear about something. You have 30 days to consider our generous offer. This is a fair solution that serves everyone's interests, and I strongly encourage you to accept it. The alternative is likely to be much more expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved." The threat in her words was barely concealed. She was telling me that if I didn't accept her $75,000 offer, she would make my life miserable through legal challenges and bureaucratic harassment until I had no choice but to give up. After Officer Rodriguez left, Patricia and Jack lingered for a moment, clearly savoring their apparent victory. Jack couldn't resist getting in one last dig. "Guess you won't be needing that fancy security camera anymore, old man. Won't be your property much longer anyway." Patricia placed a restraining hand on her son's arm, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She had turned what should have been my moment of triumph into her opportunity to corner me into selling my family's land at a fraction of its value. Standing there on the porch of my brother's cabin, watching Patricia and Jack walk away with confident smiles, I felt more alone than I had since David's funeral. But as I watched them leave, I realized that Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her calculated presentation. She'd been so focused on demonstrating her power that she'd revealed too much about her long-term planning. The question now was whether I had the resources and determination to fight back against someone who had clearly been playing this game much longer than I had. Type fight if you want Marcus to keep battling, or give up if you think he should take the money. I spent the next 2 days calling every attorney I could find who dealt with property law, and the conversations were all depressingly similar. The lawyers I spoke with estimated that fighting Patricia's forced purchase would cost between $15,000 and $25,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee of success. As a data analyst for a mid-sized company, I had a decent income, but I didn't have that kind of money sitting around for a legal battle. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. I was being forced to sell valuable property for a fraction of its worth because I couldn't afford to fight for it. On the third night, I found myself sitting by the lake with a glass of David's whiskey, seriously considering Patricia's offer. The $75,000 would at least give me something, and it would end this nightmare of harassment and legal threats. I pulled out the letter I'd written to David but never sent, and for the first time since his death, I seriously considered adding a final paragraph. "I'm sorry, brother. I wasn't strong enough to protect the place you loved." My hand was actually reaching for the lighter I'd brought outside when I heard someone calling my name from the shoreline. It was Henry, my elderly neighbor, carrying a thermos of tea and wearing a concerned expression that reminded me of my own father. "I saw you sitting out here looking defeated, and I thought you might want some company," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "I've been through my own battles with Patricia Walsh, and I know how isolating it can feel when you're fighting her alone." He explained that 2 years ago, Patricia had tried to fine him for his vegetable garden, claiming it violated community aesthetic standards. She didn't win that fight, but she made sure I understood the cost of opposing her. That's when I started keeping detailed records of everything she did. Henry's story gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in days. He told me about Patricia's most ambitious project, a massive stone wall that she'd built around her entire backyard property, claiming it was funded by the HOA's landscaping budget as a community beautification initiative. The wall was impressive, made from expensive natural stone and professionally installed by what appeared to be a high-end contractor. She said it was being paid for by the HOA's landscaping fund to improve the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood, Henry explained. But here's the thing that never made sense to me. That wall is entirely within her private property boundaries. I've never seen a single community benefit from it. As Henry spoke, I felt my data analyst instincts kicking in for the first time since this whole ordeal began. There was something about the timing and the money that didn't add up. Patricia had been aggressively expanding her power through the HOA, pushing through vague regulations like Section 12.C, and somehow finding the budget for expensive community improvements that only seemed to benefit her property. "Henry," I said, "do you have any idea how much that wall cost?" He shook his head, but then suggested something that changed the entire trajectory of my thinking. "As a property owner in the community, you have the right to request detailed financial records from the HOA. It's in the bylaws." The next morning, Jack and his friends showed up for what they announced as a farewell party for me. They'd brought a professionally printed banner that read, "Goodbye Marcus, thanks for the lake," and were playing music loud enough to wake the dead. But instead of getting angry or confronted, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. These weren't just random acts of harassment. They were psychological warfare designed to make me feel helpless and isolated. Patricia was counting on me to break down and accept her offer just to make the torment stop, but I was finally beginning to see the bigger picture. I spent the rest of the day drafting a formal request for HOA's financial records, using the legal language that Henry had helped me research. As a property owner, I had the legal right to examine the association's books, and I wasn't just asking for general information. I wanted detailed records of every expenditure related to community beautification for the past 3 years, including contracts, invoices, bank statements, and documentation of all work performed. I also requested copies of all appraisals, surveys, and legal opinions related to lakefront property management. Henry came over that evening to help me review the request before I submitted it. "This is good," he said, reading through the document carefully. Very thorough, very professional. She won't be able to delay or refuse this without exposing herself to legal liability. We made sure to copy every board member and include a note explaining that I was conducting due diligence before making any decisions about the property purchase offer. I didn't explicitly accuse anyone of impropriety, but I made it clear that I was taking a close look at how community funds were being managed. When I submitted the request to the HOA management company the next morning, I felt like I was finally taking offensive action instead of just reacting to Patricia's attacks. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't just defending myself, I was investigating. David had always said that problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved, and that the key was to approach them systematically rather than emotionally. I had been letting Patricia's intimidation tactics cloud my judgment, but now I was ready to use my professional skills to fight back. That night, I sat on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee instead of whiskey, feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. The financial records would either vindicate Patricia's claims about community spending, or they would reveal something that she didn't want exposed. Either way, I would finally have the information I needed to make an informed decision about my future. The question was whether Patricia would cooperate with my request, or whether she would try to hide whatever secrets those financial records contained. Comment if you think Marcus will find something suspicious in the HOA financial records. Patricia Walsh tried every trick in the book to delay providing the financial records I'd requested. First, she claimed that the documents needed to be organized and redacted for privacy compliance. Then she said that some of the files were stored off-site with the HOA's accounting firm and would take several weeks to retrieve. Finally, she insisted that I needed to schedule an appointment with their attorney to review the documents under legal supervision. But I had done my homework, and I knew that as a property owner, I had the legal right to examine these records within a reasonable time frame. While I waited for the financial documents, Patricia launched what I can only describe as a campaign of bureaucratic terrorism designed to create the paper trail she needed to justify taking my property. Every single day I received a new violation notice in my mailbox, each one more ridiculous than the last. Day 1, my kayak was the wrong shade of blue and created visual discord with the natural lake environment, resulting in a fine of $100. Day 2, I had positioned my outdoor furniture at an angle that didn't conform to the directional guidelines for lakefront seating arrangements, which cost me $75. Day 3 brought a violation notice that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so clearly calculated to drive me insane. According to the official HOA document, I had hung a towel on my porch railing in a manner that violated the textile display standards outlined in Section 12.c. The fine was $50, and the notice included a detailed explanation of the proper way to hang towels in lakefront areas to maintain aesthetic harmony with the natural environment. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The pattern became crystal clear when I received the 4th violation notice. This one informed me that I had now accumulated more than 3 violations in a single week, which, according to Section 12.c, constituted chronic non-compliance with community standards. The notice went on to explain that chronic non-compliance accelerated the timeline for property acquisition, and that the HOA would now be moving forward with the purchase of my lakefront property within 7 days instead of the original 30-day timeline. Patricia wasn't just harassing me with these ridiculous fines, she was manufacturing evidence to justify stealing my property. I sat in my kitchen, staring at this latest violation notice, and felt something click into place in my mind. Patricia wasn't just trying to drive me crazy with bureaucratic harassment. She was creating a legal paper trail to support her claim that I was a chronic violator who needed to be removed from the community. The violation notices weren't punishments. They were manufactured evidence designed to give her legal cover for what amounted to theft. It was brilliant in its cynicism, and it was working exactly as she had planned. In desperation, I called Henry and explained what was happening. She's not just trying to buy my property, I told him. She's creating legal justification to take it away from me, whether I want to sell or not. Henry listened to my explanation and then was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," he finally said, "I think I may have something that could help you. Can you come over to my house tonight? I've been keeping records of my own, and I think it's time you saw them." When I arrived at Henry's house that evening, he led me to his home office, which was filled with the kind of meticulous record-keeping you'd expect from a retired engineer. "I've been documenting Patricia's behavior for 2 years," he explained, pulling out several thick folders organized with military precision. "I started keeping records after she tried to find me for my vegetable garden. I had a feeling that eventually someone would need proof of her pattern of abuse. He handed me a folder labeled Financial Irregularities that would change everything. Inside the folder were photographs, printed emails, and handwritten notes documenting various suspicious expenditures by the HOA over the past 2 years. Henry had been conducting his own investigation, and what he'd found painted a picture of systematic embezzlement disguised as community improvement projects. The stone wall around Patricia's property had cost the HOA $47,000, paid to a company called Greenscape Landscaping. But when Henry had looked up Greenscape's business registration, he'd discovered that the company was registered to an address that turned out to be Patricia's home. We spent the next 3 hours going through Henry's documentation, and the picture that emerged was of a woman who had been using her position as HOA president to systematically loot the community's funds. Patricia had been funneling association money into her personal projects, always under the guise of community beautification or property value enhancement. The stone wall was just the most obvious example. There were also payments for landscape consultation, drainage improvement, and aesthetic maintenance that all seemed to benefit only Patricia's property. Armed with Henry's research, I was finally able to make sense of the financial records when the HOA management company reluctantly provided them 2 days later. Using my skills as a data analyst, I created a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking every payment to Greenscape Landscaping and related companies over the past 3 years. The total was staggering. $47,000 in community funds had been paid to companies that were essentially Patricia's personal contracting fronts, with every penny used for improvements to her private property, while the rest of the community saw no benefit whatsoever. The smoking gun was a series of invoices for community lakefront enhancement that totaled $12,000. According to the invoices, this money had been spent on shoreline beautification and erosion control measures that were supposed to benefit the entire community. But when I walked around the entire lake perimeter with Henry, we couldn't find a single sign of any work that had been performed. The invoices were completely fabricated, the work had never been done, and the $12,000 had simply disappeared into Patricia's personal accounts. I spent the rest of the night creating a comprehensive report documenting Patricia's embezzlement scheme. I included photographs of her stone wall, copies of the fake invoices, proof that Greenscape was registered to her home address, and a detailed financial analysis showing how community funds had been systematically diverted to her personal projects over a period of 3 years. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Patricia Walsh had been stealing from her own community for years, and she had been using her position as HOA president to cover her tracks. As I sat there in David's cabin, surrounded by evidence of Patricia's crimes, I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about property boundaries or noise complaints. It was about a corrupt official who had been systematically robbing her community and was now trying to steal my inheritance to cover her tracks. The forced purchase of my property for $75,000 wasn't just a power play. It was Patricia's way of eliminating the one person who had stumbled onto evidence of her financial crimes. I called Henry to tell him what I discovered, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Marcus," he said, "I've been wondering for 2 years how to expose her, but I never had enough evidence to make anyone listen. Now we have her dead to rights." We agreed that the next step was to present this evidence to the entire community. Patricia had been counting on fighting me in isolation, but now it was time to turn this into a public confrontation where her crimes would be exposed for everyone to see. Type busted if you think Patricia will be caught, or escape if you think she'll find a way out. Henry helped me draft a letter requesting an emergency HOA meeting to discuss urgent financial matters that could affect property values and community reputation throughout the neighborhood. We didn't mention Patricia's embezzlement directly, but we made it clear that we had discovered issues that needed immediate attention from the entire community. The letter was professional and diplomatic, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of threat that Patricia would certainly recognize when she read it. 42 of the 47 homeowners showed up for the meeting, which was held in the community center on a Wednesday evening. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one place, and the energy in the room was tense with anticipation. People were whispering to each other, clearly wondering what kind of financial crisis could be serious enough to warrant an emergency meeting. Patricia, as HOA president, was running the meeting, and she looked completely confident as she called everyone to order. She had no idea what Henry and I had prepared, but she clearly believed she was still in control of the situation. Before we discuss the financial matters that Marcus has requested, Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been running these meetings for years, I want to inform everyone that we have reached a positive resolution to the property dispute that has been disrupting our community. The HOA has agreed to purchase the disputed lakefront area for $75,000, which will ensure continued public access for all residents. Several people in the audience nodded approvingly, and Patricia smiled with satisfaction, clearly expecting this announcement to deflate whatever complaints I might have prepared. When Patricia called on me to speak, I stood up and connected my laptop to the projector at the front of the room. Thank you all for coming tonight, I began, looking out at the sea of faces that represented my entire community. I want to share some information that I think everyone needs to see. The first slide was the security camera footage of Jack deliberately destroying my brother's garden, including the crystal clear audio where he bragged to his friends about teaching the old man a lesson. You could hear people in the audience gasp as they watched a member of their community leadership family committing deliberate vandalism. The second slide was the original survey map from 1987, showing that the lakefront area actually belonged to my family, not the HOA. I explained how this meant that Jack had been trespassing on private property while his mother, as HOA president, had been facilitating it for years. The third slide showed the current HOA map alongside the original survey, making it crystal clear that the community had been operating under false assumptions about property boundary. The murmur of voices in the room grew louder as people began to understand the implications. Now let's talk about finances, I continued, advancing to the next slide. How many of you have heard of Greenscape Landscaping? A few hands went up tentatively. Greenscape has received $47,000 in HOA funds over the past 3 years for various community improvement projects. I clicked to the next slide, showing Patricia's stone wall in all its expensive glory. This is where that money went. Every single dollar was spent on improvements to Patricia's private property, while the rest of the community saw no benefit whatsoever. The room erupted in angry voices as people began to understand what they were seeing. Patricia jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger and panic. "This is a personal attack," she shouted over the growing noise. "This man is trying to destroy our community because he doesn't want to follow our rules." But I was ready for her response. I clicked to the next slide, showing the business registration for Greenscape Landscaping, with Patricia's home address clearly visible as the registered business location. "The address for Greenscape Landscaping is Patricia's house," I said calmly, letting the implications sink in. "She's been paying herself with community funds for work that was never done, or that only benefited her private property." The final slide showed the fake invoices for community lakefront enhancement that had supposedly cost $12,000 but had never been performed. This money was supposed to be spent on shoreline improvements that would benefit everyone. Instead, it just disappeared into Patricia's personal accounts. Henry stood up from the back of the room, holding his folder of documentation. "I have additional evidence," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "I've been tracking Patricia's financial irregularities for 2 years. She's been using her position as HOA president to embezzle from this community, and now she's trying to steal Marcus's property to cover her tracks." He began reading from his meticulously organized notes, detailing payment after payment that had gone to Patricia's fake company while the community received nothing in return. The crowd was now openly hostile toward Patricia, with people shouting questions and demands for explanations. Patricia tried to maintain control, claiming that all the expenses had been legitimate community improvements, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. When someone in the audience called out, "Where's our money, Patricia?" she finally lost her composure completely and revealed the truth that sealed her fate. "Fine!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Maybe I did use some community funds for my projects, but I've been working for this community for years without proper compensation. I deserve to be paid for my service." Her admission of guilt hung in the air like a confession, and everyone in the room heard it clearly. At that moment, Officer Rodriguez appeared at the back of the room. Henry had quietly invited him to attend the meeting for security purposes, but now he had witnessed Patricia's public admission of embezzlement. Within 2 weeks, Patricia was facing criminal charges for misuse of community funds and fraud. Jack was required to complete 200 hours of community service and pay full restitution for the damage to my brother's garden. The HOA voted to remove Patricia from office immediately and elected Henry as interim president with a mandate to implement financial transparency measures. I kept the lakefront property and opened a small section as David's Memorial Garden, where community members could visit and pay their respects. 6 months later, I received a letter from a law firm representing Patricia, who was now serving time in county jail. The letter informed me that she was planning to appeal her conviction and was considering a civil lawsuit against me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It seemed that even from behind bars, Patricia wasn't ready to give up her fight for control. I showed the letter to Henry, who just shook his head and said, "Some people never learn." Never underestimate the quiet ones. They might just have the power to expose your secrets. If you enjoyed watching Patricia get her karma, hit that like button. Your support through donations keeps these justice stories coming. Thanks for watching BD Stories, and stick around for more tales where bullies get what they deserve. Never underestimate the quiet ones. We might just expose your secrets. If you enjoyed this justice story, hit that like button. Your support helps us keep investigating these stories. Thanks for watching BD Stories. Comment Part 2 for Patricia's prison revenge.